Imagine your grandfather hands you a crisp $100 bill in 1971. He tells you to save it, tells you it's worth something, tells you the American dollar is as good as gold. Literally. Because back then, it was. Every dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. $35, 1 ounce. That was the promise. That was the anchor. That was the rule that kept the printing press in check. Now imagine it's August 15th, 1971. A secret meeting at Camp David. No press. No Congress. No foreign allies notified. President Nixon and 15 advisors behind closed doors. What they decided that weekend would silently confiscate 90% of your purchasing power over the next 50 years. They called it a temporary suspension. They called it protecting American workers. They called it necessary. But here's what they didn't call it: the largest wealth transfer in human history. Your grandfather's $100 bill. Today it buys $10 worth of goods, not because you spent it poorly, not because the economy collapsed, but because they severed the one thing that made money honest. How did closing the gold window steal 90% of your purchasing power, and why can't they ever open it again? Let's go back to that weekend. August 13th, 1971, Camp David. The official story they told the American public was simple. International speculators were attacking the dollar. Foreign central banks, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, were draining America's gold reserves. This was a defensive move, a temporary measure to stabilize the economy and protect American workers. Treasury Secretary John Connolly put it bluntly to European finance ministers. The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. The narrative was clear. America was the victim. The gold window had to close to save the system. But here's what the data actually showed. US gold reserves in 1950 stood at 20,000 tons. By 1971, they had collapsed to 8,100 tons. That's a 60% decline in 2 decades. Meanwhile, foreign claims on US dollars had exploded to $80 billion. Now do the simple calculation. At $35 per ounce, America's remaining gold could only cover $10 billion in claims, an 8-to-1 gap. The promise of convertibility wasn't under attack. It was already dead. It had been a lie for years. What created this crisis? 2 words: guns and butter. President Johnson's simultaneous financing of the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs. The Vietnam War alone cost $738 billion in today's money. The Great Society added massive welfare expansion on top. How do you pay for both without raising taxes or cutting other spending? You print money. From 1960 to 1971, the US money supply grew at 8.2% annually. GDP growth during the same period? 4.1%. You're creating twice as much money as you're creating real economic output. Every new dollar dilutes the value of existing dollars. Every new dollar makes the gold backing more fictional. France saw it first. De Gaulle called the Bretton Woods system a mechanism for American imperialism, and he wasn't wrong. Between 1965 and 1968, France converted $750 million into gold. Why? Because they recognized the fundamental fraud. The United States was printing dollars to finance spending it couldn't afford, then forcing other countries to accept those depreciating dollars in trade, while the gold backing evaporated. De Gaulle was calling America's bluff, and the bluff was exposed. So when Nixon closed the gold window that August weekend, he wasn't protecting the dollar, he was freeing the printing press. The Bretton Woods system had imposed discipline. Every dollar theoretically backed by $35 worth of gold meant there was a hard limit to money creation. Break that promise, and you destroy the currency's credibility. Maintain that promise, and you can't finance unlimited wars and unlimited welfare simultaneously. Nixon chose the printing press. Within weeks, the world knew this wasn't temporary. By December 1971, the dollar was devalued 8.5% against gold. $35 per ounce became $38. By 1973, another devaluation to $42.22. Then, in 1973, they stopped pretending entirely. Free-floating fiat currency became permanent. No more gold backing, no more convertibility, no more anchor-limiting currency creation. What happened next wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. When you remove the constraint on money printing, every incentive shifts toward inflation. The only question is how fast your purchasing power disappears. The decade following Nixon's decision delivered exactly what you'd expect: when you remove all constraints on currency creation. In 1971, inflation stood at 4.3%. By 1974, it had exploded to 11.1%. The oil shock accelerated it, sure, but monetary expansion enabled it. You can't have price inflation without currency inflation first. By March 1980, inflation peaked at 13.5%. Cumulative inflation from 1971 to 1980? 112%. Prices more than doubled in a single decade. Compare that to the Bretton Woods era. From 1944 to 1971, average annual inflation ran at 2.5%. Under fiat currency from 1971 to 2024, 3.9% annually. That difference of 1.4% seems small, almost trivial, but compound it over 53 years and you see the real theft. Under the gold-backed system, a dollar would have lost 73% of its value over that time span. Under fiat, 90%. That extra 1.4% annually is the cost of removing discipline from the system. Now let's talk about what this meant for actual human beings trying to build a life. In 1971, the median household income was $10,285. Adjusted for inflation, that's $77,800 in today's purchasing power. The 2023 median household income, $74,580. Real purchasing power declined 4.1%, despite women's workforce participation rising from 43% in 1970 to 57% in 2023. Read that again. Households now need two incomes to achieve less purchasing power than one income provided in 1971. The housing market tells the same story with even sharper clarity. In 1971, the median home price was $25,200. That's 2.5 times the median income. A family could realistically save for a down payment and afford a mortgage on a single income. By 2024, the median home price hit $417,700. That's 5.6 times median income. Home ownership shifted from accessible to barely attainable. Cars followed the same trajectory. The average new car in 1971 cost $3,430, or 33% of median income. Today, $48,000, 64% of median income. Here's the mechanism they never explain in economics textbooks. When currency isn't backed by gold or any hard asset, governments face no real constraint on spending. They can finance wars, welfare programs, corporate bailouts, anything, by simply creating new currency. But every new dollar created dilutes the value of every dollar already in circulation. It's not complicated. If there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, prices rise. You didn't get poorer because you made bad choices. You didn't fall behind because you failed to work hard enough. You got poorer because they expanded the money supply faster than the economy grew, and that expansion stole your purchasing power silently, year after year, compounding relentlessly. This wasn't a bug in the system. This was the system working exactly as designed. Fiat currency enables unlimited government spending financed by an invisible tax on everyone holding dollars, and it was only just beginning. But here's the part they never teach you in economics class. New money doesn't enter the economy evenly. It doesn't get distributed fairly to every citizen. It enters through specific channels: banks, financial institutions, government contractors, asset holders. Those closest to the money spigot spend it before prices rise. By the time it reaches ordinary workers as wages, prices have already adjusted upward. This is called the Cantillon Effect, named after an 18th century economist who recognized that inflation isn't neutral. It's a wealth transfer mechanism with clear winners and losers. Watch what happened to asset prices versus wages after 1971. The S&P 500 stood at 100 points in 1971. By 2024, it hit 4,783. That's a 47.8 times increase. Real wage growth over the same period? 12.4% total. Not annually, total, over 53 years. While stocks multiplied nearly 50-fold, wages barely budged. Wealth inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, rose from 0.394 in 1971 to 0.481 in 2024. Higher numbers mean more inequality. The gap is widening, and it's accelerating. Now look at where the newly created money actually went. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet in 1971 was $80 billion. By 2008, before the financial crisis, it had grown to $870 billion. Today, $7.2 trillion. That's a 90-fold increase in 53 years. Where did that $7 trillion go? Quantitative easing from 2008 to 2014 created $3.7 trillion, primarily used to purchase mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds from banks, not from homeowners, not from workers, from banks. The result? Bank stock values soared while the home ownership rate declined from 69% in 2004 to 65% in 2023. The wealth concentration is stark and undeniable. The top 1% share of total wealth in 1971 was 23%. Today, it's 35%. The bottom 50% held 2.9% of wealth in 1971. Today, they hold 2.5%. They got poorer in both relative and absolute terms while trillions were created and injected into the financial system. Here's how it works in practice. When the Federal Reserve creates money to buy bonds, it doesn't give that money to workers, it gives it to bondholders, primarily banks, hedge funds, and wealthy investors. They receive cash for their bonds, then use that liquidity to purchase assets like stocks, real estate, and commodities. Asset prices rise. If you own assets, you get richer. If you only earn wages, you fall further behind with every round of money creation. This isn't a bug. It's the designed feature of fiat currency. Even foreign governments benefited from this system while American workers suffered. Foreign central banks holding US treasuries went from $50 billion in 1971 to $7.6 trillion in 2024. China's holdings peaked at $1.32 trillion in 2013. Japan currently holds $1.13 trillion. These foreign governments buy treasuries with dollars earned from trade surpluses, then earn interest paid by American taxpayers. The United States exports inflation and imports goods, while foreign creditors collect interest payments funded by your taxes. The closer you are to the money creation, the more you benefit. The further away, the more you lose. Here's where the system reveals its terminal flaw. Once you abandon the gold standard and begin financing spending through currency creation, you trigger a debt spiral that becomes impossible to escape. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1971, US national debt stood at $398 billion, representing 35% of GDP. By 2024, the debt hit $36 trillion. That's 123% of GDP. The debt didn't just grow, it metastasized. But the real crisis isn't the debt itself, it's the interest payments. In 1971, interest on the national debt cost $19 billion annually, consuming 9.8% of federal revenue. Manageable, sustainable. Today, interest payments consume $892 billion, 14.5% of federal revenue, and that's with historically suppressed interest rates. At 5% average rates, which is below the historical norm, the Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will hit $1.8 trillion by 2034. That's 33% of all federal revenue going just to service existing debt, not to pay it down, not to fund any actual government services, just to cover the interest. Now let's be clear about the options available. To actually pay down this debt through budget surpluses, you would need to either cut spending by 40%, which is politically impossible since entitlement programs alone exceed total revenue, or raise taxes to 1950s levels with a 91% top marginal rate, which would be economically devastating and politically suicidal, or grow GDP at 6% or higher annually for decades, which hasn't happened since the 1960s and shows no sign of happening now. None of these options are realistic. None of them will happen. That leaves exactly one path forward. Inflate the debt away. Create more currency. Devalue the debt in real terms, and simultaneously destroy the purchasing power of everyone holding dollars. It's not a choice. It's an inevitability built into the structure of fiat currency. The Federal Reserve already showed you the playbook. From 2020 to 2022, they created $5 trillion, the largest peacetime monetary expansion in American history. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell admitted in December 2021 that it was time to retire the word transitory when describing inflation. Translation: we printed too much, and now we can't control the consequences. Inflation in 2021 hit 4.7%. By 2022, it reached 8%, the highest rate since 1981. But here's what should terrify you. Foreign central banks are watching this unfold and they're heading for the exits. Central bank gold purchases in 2010 totaled 77 tons. By 2022, that number exploded to 1,136 tons. That's a 14.8 times increase. China's official gold reserves went from 1,054 tons in 2009 to 2,264 tons in 2024, and the actual number is almost certainly higher since China has every incentive to underreport. Russia accumulated gold even more aggressively, going from 402 tons in 2007 to 2,332 tons today. Why are they doing this? Because they recognize the endgame. The United States cannot and will not repay its debt in dollars with equivalent purchasing power to the dollars that were borrowed. The debt will be inflated away, which means every foreign holder of US treasuries will be repaid in devalued currency. They're quietly returning to gold as a reserve anchor because they know what's coming. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed, and the design includes your purchasing power as the release valve. Let's make this concrete and personal. If your grandfather put $10,000 in a savings account in 1971, earning the average savings rate of 5.25% annually, by 2024 that would have grown to approximately $106,000. Sounds like a decent return, right? Except here's the reality. Adjusted for inflation, that $106,000 has the purchasing power of just $11,200 in 1971 terms. He earned 5.25%, but lost 3.9% annually to inflation. His real return was 1.35% over 53 years. He worked, he saved, he did everything right, and the system robbed him anyway. Meanwhile, if he had bought gold instead, the outcome would have been radically different. $10,000 in 1971 at $35 per ounce bought him 286 ounces. Today, at $2,650 per ounce, those 286 ounces are worth $758,100. That's a 75.8 times gain in real purchasing power, or consider the S&P 500. That same $10,000 invested in 1971 would be worth $478,300 today, a 47.8 times increase in real terms. The lesson is unavoidable. Fiat currency punishes savers and rewards asset owners. This isn't accidental, it's structural. Inflation benefits debtors, and government is the largest debtor in human history. Inflation hurts creditors and savers, which is everyone holding cash or dollar-denominated fixed-income assets. It benefits those who own stocks, real estate, commodities, anything whose price can rise with currency debasement. This is the incentive structure of the system, and understanding it is the difference between building wealth and watching it evaporate. So what do you do with this information? First, recognize the reality. Your dollars lose 3 to 4% of their purchasing power every year by design, not by accident. Holding cash is guaranteed wealth destruction over any meaningful time frame. Social security, pensions, and bonds are all denominated in depreciating dollars, which means their real value declines every year even if the nominal numbers stay the same. Second, position yourself accordingly. Hold assets that appreciate faster than inflation. Stocks have historically returned 10% annually. Real estate returns 3.5% plus rental income. Commodities and hard assets with limited supply protect against currency debasement. Minimize your exposure to dollar-denominated debt instruments unless they yield above inflation, which almost none currently do. Third, understand the macro trend you're living through. Federal debt exceeding 120% of GDP has historically preceded either sovereign default or currency debasement. There is no third option. History shows this pattern repeatedly across centuries and continents. When interest payments exceed 15% of government revenue, you enter a fiscal death spiral. Greece experienced this in 2010. Argentina has experienced it repeatedly. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar Germany, the list goes on. When interest costs force money printing to service the debt, hyperinflation becomes not just possible, but probable. The 1971 Nixon Shock didn't just end the gold standard. It launched the largest wealth transfer in human history, systematically moving purchasing power from savers to debtors, from wage earners to asset owners, from citizens to governments. Over 53 years, the dollar lost 90% of its purchasing power. That's not a failure of the system. That's the system functioning exactly as designed. Your choice is simple. Understand the rules of fiat currency and position yourself accordingly, or keep playing by the old rules and watch your purchasing power evaporate. The gold window closed in 1971. It's never opening again.